it be,
your entire
when will
career,
it be
frankly.
that the members of this committee on a bipartisan basis demand answers to those questions and refuse to accept
Clearly you're a failed lawyer
refuse to
because you don't
accept,
understand when
excuse
someone
me,
can and cannot
refuse
answer
to
a
accept
question.
personal slander.
Attorney General Bondi.
I wish you love Chicago as much as you hate President Trump. And currently, the National Guard are on the way to Chicago. If you're not going to protect your citizens, President Trump will.
Been on this committee for more than 20 years. That's the kind of testimony you expect from this administration. A simple question as to whether or not they had a legal rationale for deploying National Guard troops becomes grounds for a personal attack. I think it's a legitimate question. It's my response.
Okay, so Attorney General Pam Bondi is facing what could be the end of her career after a federal judge just released what's being called a nightmare timeline that details her involvement in missing evidence, hidden files, and a pattern of courtroom misconduct that's now impossible to deny. We're talking about a minute-by-minute breakdown of Bondi's actions on the day crucial case files disappeared from a federal courthouse, complete with surveillance footage timestamps, witness statements, and custody log entries that paint a devastating picture of deliberate evidence tampering. The judge didn't just release this timeline quietly. The judge laid it out in open court during an emergency session, systematically destroying Bondi's credibility and leaving her legal team absolutely reeling. This timeline is a prosecutorial roadmap. It shows exactly when Bondi entered secure evidence areas, how long she was there unsupervised, which documents she accessed, and which files were later reported missing. The level of detail is stunning. The judge has timestamps down to the minute, has matched surveillance footage to custody logs, and has identified multiple instances where proper procedures weren't followed. When a federal judge takes the time to construct this kind of detailed timeline and then releases it publicly, it's essentially writing the criminal referral for prosecutors. The judge is saying, here's exactly what happened, here's the evidence proving it, and here are the laws that were broken. The emergency court session where this timeline was revealed was apparently chaotic. Bondi's lawyers were caught completely off guard by how comprehensive and damning the judge's findings were. They had been arguing that any irregularities in evidence handling were innocent mistakes or procedural oversights. But the timeline systematically destroys those explanations by showing a pattern of conduct that can only be interpreted as deliberate. The judge specifically used the phrase government misconduct and deliberate obstruction in describing what the timeline reveals, which are incredibly serious accusations against the nation's attorney general. The timeline focuses on a specific incident where Bondi allegedly made a solo visit to an evidence room just before crucial documents disappeared. According to the judge's findings, Bondi accessed this secure area without proper authorization, spent significant time there alone without supervision, and left with materials that were not properly logged. Surveillance footage confirms her presence in areas where she shouldn't have been, and custody logs show gaps and inconsistencies that line up exactly with the times Bondi was in those areas. When you put all of this together chronologically as the judge did, it creates an undeniable narrative of someone who deliberately manipulated evidence for improper purposes. Court records and witness testimonies that the judge cited reveal this wasn't an isolated incident. The timeline shows multiple failures to record or properly secure evidence, all occurring during periods when Bondi had access to secure areas. Witnesses have come forward describing how Bondi would show up at courthouses unannounced, insist on accessing evidence rooms, and then leave with materials without following proper checkout procedures. Court staff members who tried to enforce proper protocols reportedly faced pressure from Bondi to look the other way or to falsify logs to cover her tracks after the fact. Legal experts who've reviewed the timeline are saying it essentially writes itself as a criminal referral. When you have a federal judge laying out this level of documented misconduct with supporting evidence at every step, prosecutors have everything they need to bring charges. The timeline establishes that Bondi had access to the evidence, that evidence went missing after she accessed it, that proper procedures weren't followed, and that there's a pattern of similar conduct across multiple incidents. Those are all the elements needed to prove evidence tampering beyond reasonable doubt. The pressure on Bondi is now coming from every direction. Lawmakers from both parties are demanding her resignation and calling for criminal investigations. Legal associations are filing ethics complaints. Public watchdog groups are organizing campaigns demanding her removal. Major headlines are describing her career as all but over if charges are actually filed. The combination of the judge's detailed timeline, the public nature of its release, and the mounting calls for accountability has created a crisis that Bondi cannot simply ignore or spin away. Bondi's response so far has been to attack the judge and to claim the timeline is politically motivated. She's arguing that the judge is biased against her because of her association with Trump, and that the timeline cherry-picks evidence to make innocent conduct look sinister. But those arguments ring hollow when the judge has provided such detailed documentation, with timestamps, video evidence, and witness corroboration. It's very difficult to claim bias when a judge has taken the time to construct an airtight factual record that speaks for itself. The Yahoo News reporting on missing minutes in what they're calling the MAGA Beauty Queen case provides additional context about Bondi's pattern of evidence problems. This isn't the first time documents have gone missing or been altered in cases Bondi has been involved with. The timeline the judge just released is being viewed as the culmination of a pattern that's been building for months, where evidence mysteriously disappears or changes in ways that benefit Bondi's preferred outcomes. Each individual incident might have been explained away as coincidence or mistake, but when you see the full pattern laid out chronologically, it becomes clear that something systematic was happening. The Washington Post's coverage of government misconduct in related cases shows that judges are increasingly willing to call out prosecutors and government officials who abuse their positions. The Post highlighted how federal judges have been blasting potential government misconduct in multiple high-profile cases, suggesting that the judiciary has decided it can no longer stay silent when executive branch officials appear to be corrupting legal proceedings. Bondi's case represents perhaps the most extreme example of this trend, with a sitting attorney general being publicly accused by a federal judge of deliberately obstructing justice. Let's dig deeper into what exactly this nightmare timeline reveals, and why it's so devastating to Bondi's legal and political position. The judge apparently spent weeks or even months compiling this timeline, reviewing surveillance footage frame by frame, cross-referencing custody logs with witness statements, and building a minute-by-minute account of what happened on the key dates when evidence went missing. This level of judicial involvement in documenting alleged misconduct is extremely rare. Judges typically rely on prosecutors and defense lawyers to develop factual records, but in this case, the judge apparently felt it necessary to personally investigate and document what had occurred. The timeline begins on a specific date, when Bondi arrived at a federal courthouse, where a case she was personally interested in was pending. Security logs show she signed in at the main entrance, which is normal procedure for anyone entering the courthouse, including government officials. But then the timeline shows something unusual. Rather than going to public courtrooms or to scheduled meetings with court staff, Bondi went directly to restricted areas where evidence for pending cases is stored. These areas require special authorization to access, and the timeline shows that Bondi either didn't have proper authorization or used her position as Attorney General to bypass normal security procedures. Surveillance footage that the judge reviewed shows Bondi entering an evidence storage room and spending approximately 30 to 45 minutes inside. The timeline notes that during this entire period, no court staff members or other authorized personnel were present with her, which violates standard protocols for evidence handling. Evidence rooms are supposed to have multiple people present whenever materials are accessed, specifically to prevent the kind of tampering or theft that can occur when someone is alone with sensitive documents. The fact that Bondi was allowed to be in that room alone for that long suggests either massive security failures or deliberate arrangements to give her unsupervised access. The timeline then shows Bondi leaving the evidence room carrying folders and materials that were not properly logged out. Custody logs that track who accesses which pieces of evidence show gaps and inconsistencies during exactly the time period when Bondi was in the evidence room. Some documents that should have been logged as checked out show no record of being removed. Other documents that were logged show Bondi's name, but with timestamps that don't match the surveillance footage, suggesting the logs were altered after the fact to try to cover up what really happened. Within hours of Bondi's visit, court staff discovered that several key documents related to the case were missing from the evidence room. These weren't random documents. They were specifically the materials that contained the most damaging information about subjects Bondi wanted to protect or that contradicted narratives she had been promoting. The coincidence of these specific documents going missing shortly after Bondi's unsupervised visit to the evidence room is what initially raised suspicions and triggered the investigation that led to the judge creating this timeline. The timeline includes testimony from multiple witnesses who saw Bondi in the courthouse that day, or who observed her behavior around evidence handling. One court employee testified about seeing Bondi carrying folders as she left the building, folders that appeared to be case files based on their markings and appearance. Another witness described how Bondi had insisted on accessing the evidence room over objections from security staff who said she needed proper authorization. A third witness recounted how after the missing documents were discovered, There were efforts to alter custody logs to make it appear that the documents had never been in the evidence room or had been properly checked out by someone else. What makes this timeline particularly damning is that it's not an isolated incident. The judge included references to at least 3 other occasions where similar patterns occurred: Bondi visiting courthouses, accessing evidence rooms, documents subsequently going missing, and custody logs showing irregularities. Each individual incident might have been explained away as coincidence or honest mistakes by court staff. But when you see multiple incidents following the same pattern, it becomes statistically impossible to claim these were all innocent errors. The pattern shows intentional, systematic evidence tampering, carried out by someone who understood the system well enough to know how to cover their tracks most of the time. The judge's use of the phrase government misconduct in describing what the timeline reveals is significant because it's one of the most serious accusations a federal judge can make about prosecutors or law enforcement officials. Government misconduct encompasses everything from deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence to manufacturing false evidence to tampering with witnesses. When judges find government misconduct, they have broad authority to impose sanctions, including dismissing cases, ordering new trials, referring prosecutors for criminal investigation, and even holding government officials in contempt. By using this language, the judge is signaling that what Bondi did wasn't just unethical or unprofessional. It was criminal conduct that warrants the most serious consequences. The phrase deliberate obstruction, that the judge also used, connects to specific federal criminal statutes about obstruction of justice. Obstruction charges require proof that the defendant knowingly interfered with judicial proceedings or investigations. The timeline the judge created provides exactly that proof by showing that Bondi knew what she was doing, deliberately accessed evidence she wasn't supposed to access, took material she wasn't authorized to take, and covered up her actions through altered logs and false statements. Each element of the obstruction statute appears to be satisfied by the facts laid out in the timeline. Legal experts analyzing the timeline have noted that it reads like a prosecution brief. The judge has done most of the work that prosecutors typically have to do in building a case, identifying the relevant facts, organizing them chronologically, matching them to specific statutes that were violated, and addressing potential defenses or alternative explanations. When prosecutors receive a detailed judicial finding like this, they can often move very quickly to charges because the hard work of investigation and case development has already been done by the judge. That's why experts are saying the timeline essentially writes the criminal referral. Prosecutors can take this document, add formal charging language, and present it to a grand jury with confidence that they have overwhelming evidence. The political dimension of this timeline is also crucial to understand. Bondi isn't just any prosecutor facing evidence tampering allegations. She's the attorney general who was handpicked by Trump to run the Justice Department and to use it to advance his political agenda. The cases where evidence went missing weren't random cases. They were cases involving Trump allies or cases that could have been embarrassing to the Trump administration. The timeline suggests that Bondi was using her position to interfere with judicial proceedings in ways that protected Trump and his associates, which transforms this from a personal ethics failure into a potential conspiracy to obstruct justice at the highest levels of government. The connection to the broader pattern of DOJ corruption under Bondi's leadership makes this timeline even more significant. Critics have been arguing for months that Bondi has politicized the Justice Department, used it to target Trump's enemies, and protected Trump's allies from prosecution. But those arguments have mostly been based on circumstantial evidence and patterns that could be explained in different ways. The timeline that the judge just released provides concrete, documented proof of Bondi personally engaging in illegal conduct to manipulate legal proceedings. That proof validates the broader criticisms and suggests that if Bondi was willing to personally tamper with evidence, she was probably willing to tolerate or encourage similar misconduct by others in the department. The Washington Post reporting on government misconduct in the Comey case and other investigations provides additional context for understanding how widespread these problems may be. The Post documented multiple instances where prosecutors or investigators appeared to have violated rules or procedures in ways that benefited politically connected defendants or that harmed politically disfavored targets. Federal judges have been increasingly willing to call out these problems publicly and to impose sanctions. The timeline in Bondi's case represents perhaps the strongest judicial statement yet about prosecutorial misconduct in politically sensitive cases. So what happens now that this nightmare timeline is public? And what are the realistic consequences for Bondi both legally and politically? Let's start with the criminal investigation that seems almost inevitable at this point. When a federal judge makes detailed findings of deliberate obstruction and government misconduct by a high-ranking government official, it creates enormous pressure on prosecutors to investigate and potentially bring charges. The question is, who investigates Bondi when she's the Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department? The typical answer would be that a special counsel needs to be appointed to investigate Bondi independently from the Justice Department she controls. But appointing a special counsel to investigate the Attorney General requires action by either Congress or by career officials at the Justice Department who are willing to defy their political boss. Given how politicized the Justice Department has become under Bondi's leadership, it's unclear whether anyone inside the department would be willing to take that step. Congress could potentially conduct its own investigation, but congressional investigations have different purposes and limitations compared to criminal investigations that could lead to prosecution. Another possibility is that state prosecutors could investigate Bondi for state crimes related to evidence tampering. While some of the conduct occurred in federal facilities and involved federal evidence, there might be state laws that were also violated. State prosecutors wouldn't need Justice Department cooperation or approval to investigate Bondi, which gives them independence that federal prosecutors might lack. Several states have strong public corruption units that have successfully prosecuted high-ranking officials, and they might see Bondi as a case where state prosecution can fill gaps left by federal inaction. The calls for Bondi's resignation are getting louder and coming from more diverse sources as the timeline becomes public. Legal associations that represent prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys have issued statements saying Bondi's continued service as Attorney General is untenable, given the documented evidence of her misconduct. These aren't partisan political groups. These are professional organizations made up of lawyers from across the political spectrum who care about maintaining the integrity of the legal system. When they're calling for an Attorney General to resign, it carries significant weight. Members of Congress from both parties are also demanding resignation or removal. Democrats have been calling for Bondi to go for months, but now some Republicans are joining those calls, at least privately. Republicans face a difficult political calculation. Defending Bondi despite documented evidence tampering makes them look complicit in corruption, but turning on Trump's Attorney General risks enraging the party base. Some Republicans are trying to thread the needle by saying Bondi should step aside temporarily while investigations proceed, which allows them to distance themselves from her without directly calling her guilty. For Bondi personally, fighting these allegations while remaining as Attorney General creates almost impossible conflicts. How can she supervise the Justice Department when that department might need to investigate her? How can she make decisions about prosecutions when her own credibility and judgment are under such serious questions? How can she maintain any authority over career prosecutors and FBI agents when federal judges are publicly documenting her misconduct? The practical reality is that even if Bondi refuses to resign, her ability to actually run the Justice Department effectively has been severely compromised. The timeline also creates huge problems for cases that Bondi has been personally involved with during her time as Attorney General. Defense lawyers in those cases will file motions arguing that any prosecution touched by Bondi is tainted and should be dismissed because of her documented history of evidence tampering. Even if courts don't dismiss entire cases, they might order evidentiary hearings to determine whether misconduct occurred in specific cases. The backlog of challenges and appeals created by Bondi's misconduct could tie up the Justice Department for years. There's also the question of what happens to the specific cases where evidence went missing according to the timeline. If key documents from those cases can't be recovered, it might be impossible to proceed with prosecutions because the evidence no longer exists. Defense lawyers will argue that the missing evidence might have been exculpatory and that without it, their clients can't get fair trials. Prosecutors will be in the impossible position of trying to explain how evidence disappeared on their watch and how they can still prove their cases without it. Some cases might have to be dismissed entirely, resulting in accused criminals going free because the Attorney General tampered with evidence. The political fallout extends beyond just Bondi to implicate Trump and his entire approach to governing. Trump appointed Bondi specifically because of her loyalty and her willingness to use the Justice Department for political purposes. The timeline documenting Bondi's evidence tampering validates everything Trump's critics have been saying about corruption at the highest levels of his administration. Democrats will use the timeline as Exhibit A in arguments that Trump needs to be stopped, that his appointees can't be trusted, and that fundamental reforms are needed to prevent future abuses. For the 2026 midterm elections, the Bondi timeline becomes powerful campaign material. Democrats can point to documented judicial findings of criminal misconduct by Trump's Attorney General as proof that their warnings about authoritarianism and corruption weren't partisan exaggeration. They can argue that voting for Republicans means tolerating or enabling the kind of behavior that the timeline documents. Republicans will have to decide whether to defend Bondi and Trump or whether to distance themselves, and either choice creates political vulnerabilities. The international implications also matter. When America's Attorney General is caught on a detailed judicial timeline tampering with evidence, it damages American credibility on rule of law issues globally. The United States regularly criticizes other countries for corruption and for politically motivated prosecutions. But how can America maintain moral authority on these issues when its own Attorney General has been documented engaging in similar conduct? Foreign leaders and media outlets are already pointing to the Bondi timeline as evidence of American hypocrisy and democratic decline. The timeline also raises questions about what else Bondi might have done that hasn't been discovered yet. If she was willing to tamper with evidence in cases that ended up before federal judges who caught her, what did she do in cases that didn't receive such scrutiny? How many other documents have gone missing or been altered in ways that haven't been noticed? Career Justice Department employees may now feel empowered to come forward with information about other instances of misconduct they witnessed, but were afraid to report while Bondi was still in power and could retaliate. Looking at historical parallels, the closest comparison might be to the Saturday Night Massacre during Watergate, when Nixon ordered the firing of the special prosecutor investigating him. That incident crystallized public understanding that Nixon was obstructing justice and accelerated the process that led to his resignation. The Bondi timeline could play a similar role by providing undeniable documented proof of corruption that cuts through partisan spin and makes it impossible to defend the conduct. Just as the Saturday Night Massacre turned many Republicans against Nixon, the Bondi timeline might be the incident that finally breaks Republican support for Trump and his appointees. For Bondi's legal team, defending her at this point seems almost impossible. How do you explain away a detailed judicial timeline with surveillance footage, witness testimony, and document evidence all pointing to deliberate misconduct? The best defense might be to negotiate a resignation deal where Bondi steps down in exchange for some kind of immunity from prosecution or reduced charges. But Trump might not allow that because he needs loyalists like Bondi in positions of power to protect him. This creates a situation where Bondi's personal legal interest in cutting a deal conflict with Trump's political interest in keeping her in place. The ultimate resolution will probably take months to fully play out, but the judge's release of this nightmare timeline marks a turning point where Bondi's position becomes untenable. Even if she somehow avoids criminal prosecution, even if Trump stands by her and refuses to demand her resignation, the timeline has destroyed her credibility and her ability to effectively serve as Attorney General. Courts will view anything she touches with deep suspicion. Career prosecutors will be afraid to work on sensitive cases under her supervision. The public will see the Justice Department as corrupt and politicized as long as she remains in charge. The only question is whether Bondi leaves voluntarily before being forced out, or whether she clings to power until she's either impeached, prosecuted, or Trump finally decides she's become too much of a liability. But one way or another, the nightmare timeline that the judge just released has sealed Bondi's fate and has created yet another crisis for an administration that seems to lurch from scandal to scandal without ever finding stable ground. For anyone who cares about rule of law and the integrity of federal law enforcement, Bondi's documented misconduct represents a low point that will require years of reform and rebuilding to recover from.